Welcome to Star Narratives, the podcast, where we have thought-provoking conversations with fascinating people, weaving in the astrological elements of their natal chart. We go so much deeper than just astrology for astrology's sake. Hi, I'm your host, Natha Campanella, and I teach people how to use the wisdom of astrology as an emotional health toolkit. Welcome to Star Narratives. I'm doing my first solo cast today. I'm very excited about it. And I apologize because the sound gets a little bit wonky here and there. I'm using a new microphone and a very slight turn of the head and the sound gets weird, but it's all a learning process, right? So anyway, just bear with me. It's nothing horrible. It's not like you're going to blow out your speakers and have to be turning your volume up and down the whole time, but just wanted to alert you that there are a few places in the recording where the sound gets a little bit lower, but then it comes back up. So anyway, I am so excited to talk today about myself for 45 minutes. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I would love to hear what you think afterwards. So send me your messages. All right, enjoy. Hello, everybody. It's Natha. So today I'm doing a solo cast, and this is my first solo cast that I've done, and so we shall see how it goes. I wanted to talk today about a planet that is very, very dominant in my chart. And I tend to pull in a lot of clients that also have a strong influence of this planet. And of course, like in everything astrological, we all have the influence of every single planet, sign, and house in our chart. And so sometimes there is far more emphasis on a planet in some person's chart than in another's. But the planets are still behind the scenes, pulling strings, so to speak, and influencing us. And certainly the planets are always in transit. And as they move through the sky, the current sky, those planets have impact and they are teaching us things. So today we're talking about Neptune. And Neptune is a planet that it took me many years to really understand Neptune. And I have to say, I probably still don't understand it thoroughly. And that's probably true for everybody because Neptune is very, it's concealed. It's undercover. It's unexpressed. And that's because it's the planet of imagination, intuition. It's the planet that is about our relationship to the divine. And that is nothing tangible. We cannot put our finger on it. We cannot describe it really with any sort of consistency or even accuracy. And I would guess that when we're talking about our relationship to the divine and to spirit in general, that is something that changes throughout our lives. So you're never going to get one pat answer. And Neptune is like that too. I want to read a little bit of Stephen Forrest's description of Neptune because he says it really well. He says that the function of Neptune is the decentralization of ego in self-imagery. Of course, that's not very easy for us humans to do because we are so egocentric. It is about us, we are the center point. We cannot help but center ourselves in almost every aspect of our lives. And yet Neptune comes in and, as Stephen Forrest says, makes the creation of a point of self-observation external to ego. And I think that, at least in my experience, has been something that has shown up through my relationship to spirituality and things that are metaphysical. I'm not religious. I would never consider myself to fall into any sort of religious category, but I am most definitely spiritual, but it's had to develop. I was raised in a house or houses with parents who were very disillusioned due to their own upbringing in organized religion. And the teachings that I received were that religion was not safe. And so it took me well into my 30s to begin to open up to this idea that there's something bigger than me out there. And it's really been life-changing. It's kind of brought me from one place to another in my life, and it's been quite the journey, and I'm still on it. So I wanted to talk about how Neptune has shown up in my chart. Because like I said, I am very Neptunian. And I had no idea that I was until I started studying astrology. And it took me a long time to really get how much of an influence this planet had. And when I began to understand it, so many things made sense to me. So anytime in a chart that we have Neptune connected to the sun or the moon, it lends to a confusion of self, lends to this sense that you don't really know who you are. It can be sort of destabilizing. And I remember watching people in school when I was younger who seemed to have so much self-confidence. They seemed to know exactly what they wanted to wear and who they wanted to be friends with and the topics that were important to them. And I always found that to be very confusing, very nebulous. And that's because Neptune is connected to both my sun and my moon, and they're both in hard aspects. I have a square to my moon and a quincunx to my sun. And so that sort of lends this feeling of floating, of a lack of clear direction. And I have certainly felt that strongly throughout my life. Now, one of the things that I see in Neptune when in the charts of people who I'm reading for, when they have a strong Neptune influence, and remember, we all have Neptune, and Neptune rules the sign of Pisces, and Neptune rules the 12th house, and we all have all three of those archetypes in our chart. So what I see is that it can go one of two ways, and it's usually going on a spectrum between both sides of Neptune. But we have the side of Neptune that is very unconscious, not a lot of awareness, not a lot of self-awareness. There can be a great desire to detach, to dissociate when you have a strong Pisces, Neptune, 12th house in your chart. And in fact, that's because the defense mechanism of Pisces as a sign is to swim away. Pisces doesn't have claws, pinchers, doesn't have a stinger to get people to back off. So it escapes. And for those of you listening, I'm sure you can think of some of your Pisces friends. And if you think of them in terms of being quote unquote escapist, you can probably come up with some good examples of that. So, something that shows up with all of the water signs, but particularly with Neptune and also with Pluto, is the tendency to escape from deep emotions with drugs, alcohol, scrolling, sex, food, because it's this sense of like, I can't bear to feel what's happening for me right now, and I must escape. And of course, we're all escapist in some ways or another. But those of us that have strong water influence are probably a little bit better at figuring out how to check out of our experience. Of course, people with a strong influence here can also be highly creative, highly imaginative. They can have some amazing fantasies. And so, of course, it's not one thing or the other. Like I said, we're all moving constantly in and out. The other thing that I see that shows up strongly in charts of people is that there's this high psychic sensitivity. There is a longing and a yearning to understand oneself through the lens of spirit. And that will show up in increments in life. It'll show up with an interest in religion or metaphysical things like tarot cards or astrology. And people will kind of graduate from one level to another. So, we have the very checked out, I can't deal with this, I have to go away in my brain side, all the way up to the, I want to experience the divine. I want to play in the field of possibility. And depending on where you're at in your spiritual awakening path, you'll probably find yourself, on that particular axis quite often. And as we grow closer and closer to understanding the world from the context of, what you hear, we are one, or there are things that are greater than we are, that helps us to separate from the centering of ourselves and our lives and our experience that on one hand is necessary. That's how we live in this world. We have to know who we are. We have to have boundaries and parameters to describe ourselves. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And yet, we don't need to, but certainly you might feel the call to tap into things that are not quite so logical, not quite so boundaried, things that are more magical and mysterious. And that's Neptune. Now, back to my own experience with Neptune. Of course, all of this completely unknown to me until really just a few years ago. When I was young, I, of course, didn't have a very clear sense of self at all. And I was somebody that could very clearly read the energy of other people. So I knew what they were feeling, almost what they were thinking. It was nonverbal, but I could feel what was happening with the people around me. I had no words for it. I didn't know that that's what was happening. I would often end up taking the feelings that I would pick up from them very personally, as if it were me, as if it were something that I was doing wrong. I thought, oh, this person is upset because of me. Oh, this person doesn't like me. There was always this clarity that I had of what was happening behind the scenes. Now, I had an experience when I was about 13 where as much as I can remember, here's what happened, is that I felt like there was a presence or a spirit that was living in my bedroom. And I didn't like it. It scared the hell out of me. And it was there for about a week. And I wouldn't go into my room. When I would go in, the air felt cold. I didn't like it. Of course, I thought I was making this up, right, in my 13-year-old brain. But I very clearly at one point said, absolutely not. I'm not open to this. I'm not going to go here. I'm not going to do this. And it was a very firm no. And it stopped. It went away. It never came back. I never had that experience of being with another presence or of even feeling like there were ghosts around. And of course, the being able to feel the emotions of other people didn't stop. But that was right around the time, about 14, when I started drinking alcohol. And that was because I could not deal with being able to intuit what my peers were thinking and saying. I couldn't do it. I was also very shy. Like I said, I had no firm sense of self, no firm sense of who I was or what I had to offer to the world. And so I started drinking alcohol. And so on one hand, this very firm saying no to the universe, to things that were invisible was very strong. And another form of saying no to being able to sense into the energy of people was beginning to drink alcohol. And certainly as a teenager, there was a lot of binge drinking. I had many experiences from about 14 until about 18 of drinking too much and really regretting it, not really losing my sense of autonomy. And it began a many year process of me and my relationship to alcohol. Of course, being Capricorn rising like I am, and Capricorn as a sign is very structured and ordered and really wants success and can be in a way very boundaried. And so I was also very boundaried with myself. I was very good. Once I got past my teen years or my early teen years, I was really good at not over drinking, and rarely did I. So I was able to keep it in check. And yet it was something that became constant in my life every single day. It didn't become constant until I was probably in my early 20s, but from my early 20s all the way until really just a few years ago, I was drinking every day or thinking about drinking every day if I wasn't. And of course, here we enter in with this thing where the dissociation is connected to Neptune, right? I didn't know who I was. I didn't feel confident enough to be moving through the world unless I was drinking. And then when I was drinking, then I felt like all the very best parts of me could come out. The parts of me that were sure, that had a sparkly, big personality. So I was just doing my thing, living my life. I had no knowledge of astrology. I was not particularly self-aware. I had a little bit of awareness because I was also lucky enough to be raised with two of my parents. I have four parents. Two of my parents were in a school, a psychological, spiritual school, the whole time that I was younger. So they brought a lot of those principles into our life. And so I had some amount of self-awareness, probably more, and I had the language for it, probably more so than many of my friends, but I wasn't really doing anything with it. It certainly wasn't central. When I was about 35, though, I was introduced to a friend who later became one of my very best friends, and she introduced me to angel cards. And that really began my new love for things metaphysical, for a new kind of spirituality. It was like I finally found something that wasn't organized religion. And I knew that I didn't have to avoid it. Because like I said, I had been very taught very strongly to avoid organized religion. And that was right around the time when I got my first astrology reading too. And the reader, her name is Melody Scott Zindel. She is an amazing astrologer. And I have been lucky enough to learn from her and receive many readings from her. And in fact, she's my astrologer to this day. Every astrologer needs an astrologer, right? I left that reading feeling so validated and feeling like I knew I was able to see myself in a really, really different way than I had been before. And it was like she was able to push aside the clouds of Neptune and let me get a view of, oh my God, that's me. That's what I look like. That's who I am. And of course it didn't last, but it was just that period of time where I got to see clearly. And that was really a very life-changing point in my life. And it's not surprisingly, right about when Neptune transits began in my chart. So Neptune began to transit first my nodes, and then it went on to transit, 1, 2, 3, 4 other planets over the last handful of years. And I'm still doing Neptune transits, by the way. So a transit, for everybody that's listening that doesn't know, like I said earlier, the planets are always in the sky. They're always moving, constant motion. Occasionally they turn backwards and we call that retrograde. So if you've heard of Mercury retrograde, for example, that's when Mercury begins to turn backward and everyone freaks out because a retrograde period brings us into a place where we have to look at what we have done in the past. Ideally, we want to go back with conscious intention to look at our mistakes, to look at even the things that have been good, but we want to look at it from a sort of detached point of view, a witness, and almost as if we were giving an employee a review. We want to say, all right, so I had that conversation with that person and it was not good, and I really lost my I lost my shit. Wish I hadn't done that, but I'm going to do it differently next time. And so we get to go back, and that's why people freak out about Mercury retrograde, because sometimes it's hard to go back and look at old things that we've said and done that have not worked out well. And of course, reforming is hard. Sometimes we don't want to go back and fix things. Sometimes we don't want to approach problems from a new perspective. And anytime a planet goes retrograde, that's what it's asking us to do. Although it's asking us to do work from the perspective of that planet, from the archetype of that planet. So Neptune in retrograde is often about having us really look at, of course, some of the ways that we're checking out, that we're not taking care of business, maybe that we're using substance or activity to numb. Neptune, I think also, like I mentioned from Stephen's quote at the beginning, is that Neptune really asks us to sort of zoom out from our very narrow perspective of, I'm a human on this earth and I need to make money, and, I need pleasure, and I have to have a nice car, and I have to have big diamond rings, and all of these things that we get obsessed with that ultimately don't really matter. Neptune asks us to kind of zoom out and get a different perspective, take a more worldly perspective, a much wider, more objective perspective. And so that's what's happening during Neptune transits. And like I said, I've had many, many years in a row of Neptune transits. And one of the things that really started to get triggered for me was this thing around drinking. Because right as Neptune began its transit to my nodes, the nodes are about your soul evolutionary path. What your soul already knows, and also what it's really wanting to learn about in this life. So Neptune hit my nodes right about the time that I decided that I wanted to close down my jewelry business. I had been a metalsmith and jewelry designer for many years and had a business selling jewelry, and I loved it. It was such a creative outlet for me to be able to work with metal and stones and create beautiful objects. I loved it so much. And it was really, really hard to let go of that business. It was very Neptunian. It took me like 3 years to make a decision. I kept going back and forth because I had for many years referred to my jewelry business as my third child. I loved it so much. But I also, on some level, knew that it was time to transition into something else, something bigger. I was selling a product, and I really wanted to be doing something that held a little bit more meaning for me. So that was right around the time that I found a life coach training program that I really, really liked. And it was also right around the time that I decided to start taking breaks from drinking. And, I would start off with like limiting, I'm not going to drink during the week, only on the weekends. That was moderately successful. Then I would move into like, I'm not going to drink for 10 days. That was successful. But my thing was that I always just kept going back, right? And in all of the really amazing sobriety circles that I run in, that I belong to, the Unruffled podcast, for example, they have a Facebook group that is just one of my favorites. So many beautiful women that are working with sobriety or sober curious or trying to do sobriety for themselves. Everybody shares all of these their different experiences of what it was like for them to drink. And from what I've learned, my drinking was very gray area. There weren't big, huge rock bottoms, but I knew that I just didn't really like it, and it made me very foggy. And that very thing that I originally was trying to, I started drinking because I wanted to fog out. I didn't want to be able to feel. And when I began life coach training, I really got that it was important to feel if I wanted to really be a good coach, somebody that could hold space, somebody that could use my own intuition to help my clients figure out what was happening for them. Drinking was it was a wall between that. And so I really wanted to stop, and I couldn't. I could go a few days at a time. I could go a month at a time, but inevitably I just couldn't stop. And here Neptune was trudging through my chart and, working the magic. And Neptune transits, by the way, are very soft and subtle. They're almost unnoticeable, and yet they are fantastic in nature. And when I'm reading for a client who's doing a big Neptune transit, I always ask them if they've noticed that their psychic sensitivities are getting stronger. Because I look at Neptune like it's, we're all born with this wand that is capable of doing magical things. Some people never activate their wand at all. Some people learn how to use it really, really skillfully. But it's not that we come in with the wand and we know how to work it. We have to get the lessons. We have to learn how to cast the spells, so to speak. And they're not really spells. It's more like if you've come in and you know that you hear things. Maybe you see things. Maybe you just know things. And you want to learn to really cultivate those skills. Cultivate being able to speak to people that have passed on, or being able to see into, other dimensions. And these things are all really, really possible for all of us. It just depends on, whether you're in this lifetime to do the psychic sensitivity bit. And if you're getting a reading with me, chances are you're more open to that than other people might be. And so I say, okay, you're doing a Neptune transit. So start looking for things to present themselves. And so, of course, this was also around the time that I started getting fascinated with tarot and teaching myself tarot and really beginning to learn more about astrology. So my psychic skills were also beginning to open up. And yet here we are with the drinking, with the blocking of that. It's very hard to wake up with a terrible headache from drinking the night before and also really open up to messages that are coming through from, whatever the tarot cards are trying to tell you, or whatever is happening, right? I remember going to the life coach training program, and it was a really amazing program. It had great people in it. I met so many people who just really wanted to help their clients feel better, and the training was great. There were a lot of retreats, and I remember watching everybody. We'd go to training all day, and then everyone would go at night and drink. And I remember thinking, like, wow, from a very detached place, right? I didn't quite have the awareness to really think, wow, how can all of this alcohol lend itself to, one, learning the next day, or processing the information that we already learned today, and really to help other people. And there were some really cool techniques that we learned in this coaching program. And I would see people, pairing off during the night parties to kind of do the work. And I was always thinking, like, how can you get really good psychological work done when you're like 2 glasses of wine down? So these were the kind of thoughts that were also kind of percolating around in my head. And so I knew, Neptune was really helping me to see very clearly that it was time to let this piece go. And in fact, this was also the time that I had to say yes to those same sensitivities that I said no to as a teenager. And I remember having a very specific thought process around it, realizing that I had asked pointedly to turn off a lot of my psychic sensitivities, and my higher self had agreed and had done that for many years for me. But now, as I was trying to open up again and learn how to really use them, it became clear that I had to rescind my no. I had to say, okay, I'm ready for these things to come back, and I'm ready to be able to use them again. And that has been a very interesting process, learning to really, really feel the depth of the superpowers. At the same time, letting the alcohol go meant that I had to start actually feeling all of those things that I was using alcohol to cover up. And so this was probably actually the scariest part of quitting drinking for me. So that brings me to my Neptune square transit. This is a transit that we all do in our early 40s. It's where the transiting Neptune in the sky comes and makes a hard aspect to the Neptune in our natal chart. For many of my clients, I do think that it's a time of deep, deep spiritual awakening. We've made it through our adolescence and our 20s and our 30s. And what I find is each decade has a different flavor. Our 20s, we're excited, we're new, we're just learning how to be adults, how to be on our own, how to have fun and yet still kind of make it in the world. And then we hit our 30s and we feel the call and the pull to do everything that society says we should do. And that depends. It's always different for everybody, but some people think that buying a house is what you should be doing. Some people think you should be having kids. Some people are really, really intent on their career, on building their career and their wealth. So it just depends, but it usually centers around something that it's a very traditional life path, depending on our own personal conditioning. And so we do all of that, and we get through our 30s and we hit our 40s, and we begin to look around and we feel like, wow, I've done all these things and I don't feel like it's quite it. I still feel a longing and a yearning, and I still feel like there's something missing, and I feel like it's something bigger than me. And that's usually right around the time that Neptune squares Neptune. And so it's this psychic opening, it's this spiritual awakening. And if you've already been on the path of spiritual awakening, it's a bigger one. And a lot becomes clear. Now, if you, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, if you're somebody that is not particularly interested in self-awareness, or you're not in this lifetime to do self-awareness, Neptune square can be a time when you retreat even further into your coping mechanisms, right? It can become where you find that you're, partying harder. Maybe you rediscover a joy for partying. I've seen that happen too, right around this transit, as people go a little bit crazy. They start going out again at night, and they want to feel, like they kind of want to forget their current life issues and problems, and they want to have fun. So it's not always spiritually awakening, but it can be. And this was right around the time that I realized that I just had to stop, period. And that was that. And I was really, really supported. Two of my best friends had already quit drinking, and one of them was many years into sobriety. One of them was a handful of years. And it just became so clear and felt so right to me to stop. And so I did. And that was, of course, right about the time that my life coaching, I had finished doing my training, and my life coaching just really began to take off. Now, when you stop doing a behavior that is serving another purpose, then you have to go back and deal with that. So what I noticed is that stopping drinking created this whole other set of quote unquote problems in my life. Because everything that I had been repressing for so many years came up for review. All of the hurts, all of the sharp edges and corners of my experience re-emerged. And it was really hard because I had to feel those things and be aware of those things from a place of sobriety. Also, through the training that I had done and continued to do, I did a number of energy trainings after I finished doing life coaching. And so I had this whole body of knowledge around self-awareness that really I couldn't really be telling my clients how to work with their stuff and avoiding my own stuff, right? It doesn't really work like that. Because as anybody who's a healer knows, that we tend to pull in people that are a vibrational match to us. And for the first little while when I was doing life coaching and I was still drinking, I swear I pulled in so many clients that just didn't want to do the work. They said they did. And we would have these conversations during our sessions, and they would be really, activated and motivated, and it would be great. And then they'd come back to the next call and they hadn't done any of the homework. They hadn't really spent any time any longer than like maybe a few hours after our session, like feeling energized and trying to make shifts, right? It was just like they fell right back into their old patterns. And that is totally what was happening to me with drinking. But once I stopped and really started to feel my own stuff, that was when I began to get clients that were also very, very interested in doing the same. And I think that's where the magic happens, right? And that is certainly where the magic began to happen for me. It was hard because all of these personal dynamics in my life, this having really poor boundaries, not being able to say no, that began to really show up for me. All of this repressed anger that I had for so many years, really, when you have bad boundaries, you get really pissed off about it, but you can't really do anything about it. So you kind of push it down. That's what I was doing anyway. So all of that came up. I had to start looking at some of the other addictions that were like secondary addictions in my life. And I think a lot of us have, it's not just a single addiction, right? It's a series of many, many addictions and many coping mechanisms. And they're really, really hard to see until we maybe take out the biggest one. And then you get to see all of the smaller pieces that are still sort of there under the surface with needs that want to be met. And so that was showing up for me too. It's like, okay, so I'm not drinking, but what about these other little addictive behaviors that I have? And, are those ones that can hang around? Are those ones that I need to get rid of? And of course, ultimately, I decided that I wanted to not be locked in. And, this is not to say that I am completely free of any of that. Of course, I'm not drinking anymore, and I haven't been drinking for almost 4 years. That feels great. And there are many of the other little smaller addictions that I have let go of. But, I still have ones that pop up, like sugar. Sugar is certainly something that I deal with on a regular basis. This and doing very much the same that I always did with alcohol, which was like, I'll go a week without eating it, only to come back strong and, go through way more than I wanted to eat in the next week. So still working on that, but we're works in progress. And I think that that's a really important piece. And certainly when we're talking about Neptune, that, it's Neptune is Neptune is very nebulous, right? Nothing is particularly hard or solid with Neptune, and we have to take that into account. We are humans. We're not going to find perfection and just stay there. That's not realistic. So, back to all of the things that were showing up. Not to mention the withdrawal from the alcohol, which anytime that you're trying to really free yourself from anything, whether it be alcohol, sugar, addiction to anything else, it's like you have to go through this withdrawal period where you're just crabby and nothing feels good. You feel like you're not allowed to have pleasure, and you have to go through all of this. And, I had to face some really, really big truths. And I had to make some really big moves. I had to end a really important long-term relationship that I was in, and it was hard. I had to face the disappointment of my family and his family, and it was crushing. And yet, because I didn't have the blurriness, the aid of alcohol, it was like I had to take one step forward and really stand strong and really have the boundaries and really finally understand very clearly my motivations and what I was doing, and really getting my own agency back of, this no longer works for me, and here's why. And so, thank you to Neptune. I also, by the way, had other transits happening that were supporting all of this. But really, the Neptune seems to be something that has, been along with me on this ride for many years. And I currently have Neptune in a transit right now to my Mars. And I'm looking at my relationship to anger, because Mars is about anger, and among other things, Mars is about speaking up for yourself and really moving into action. So I'm doing some of that now, and it's been once again very enlightening. I am noticing many new things about myself. And really, the reason that I wanted to talk about a planet and how it so strongly impacts me today, and what it's helped me to do and create, is that I'm offering a mentorship to people now, where we go into your chart and we look at the way every single planet shows up, and we really bring context to it. And we look back to your past for examples of how it has impacted you and affected you. And we also look for the lessons that it's brought you, or that it is going to bring you in the future. And like I said, it's just validating. It's validating to realize, like, we aren't, of course we have free will, and there are some elements of fate. Things just happen, and we can choose our perspective about it. But looking at your natal chart and looking and saying, this is, for me, like, of course you started using alcohol to be more social. Of course, alcohol helped to give you a framework of self, to help you feel better. And also, of course, you were going to hit a time when it was no longer functional and no longer served you. And these things are all laid out in the chart. And personally, it makes me feel better. It makes me feel like I can take a deep breath and say, okay, this is in alignment. This was all, showing, this is all happening the way that, I'm glad that it happened like this. And I'm delighted that it's going to continue to happen in this way. And I feel like I am more empowered because I know. And also, okay, so now I also really understand my psychic sensitivities. I understand that these are things that I can work with. Because you know what? Let me tell you, when I go out into public, I can zoom into somebody else's energy and feel what they're feeling, but I don't, because I learned how to have the energetic hygiene. So thank you, Neptune, for teaching me about both aspects. We have all of these different challenges that show up within our chart, but within each challenge, there are also these gifts. And we just have to learn what they are. So if you're interested in learning more about this mentorship with me, it's one-on-one. So it's all very private, and it's just you and me, and we get to spend a lot of time talking about you and sifting through who you are. And I don't know, it's one of my favorite ways to work with clients, is just getting to go much deeper than just a single astrology reading. And the feedback that I've gotten is that people just leave feeling like they can take a deep breath and they see themselves like, oh my God, all of these things I never really understood are now a lot more clear. So anyway, I think that's it. Of course, I will show you in the show notes how to find info on the mentorship. It's open by application only. You can find an application on my website. You can find the mentorship. It's called the Soul Secrets Mentorship. It's on my website at nathacampanella.com. And of course, if you have questions, I welcome questions. You can email me, or you can request a short phone call and we can talk about it. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to me go on and on today about Neptune and my first solo cast. And I look forward to our next interview, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye. Thank you so much for being here with me and listening. If you are interested in helping me, leave a review. You can leave us a star review, you can leave us a word review, but the reviews really help get the episodes and the podcast in general seen by more people. And if you want to ask me questions, give me feedback, if you have show ideas, or if you're interested in coming on the show, you can find me on my website, nathacampanella.com, or find me on Instagram at natha_campanella_astrology. Oh, and recommend this podcast to friends that you think might like it too.